David Christian is the legendary historian and professor of history at Macquarie University in Australia. He is a Russian historian and the originator of the Big History Project. Big History is a framework that teaches history from all the way from the Big Bang to the present. It brings together perspectives from across disciplines, including the sciences and the humanities, to try to build a conciliant picture of history. Here we talk about how the Big History Project has come together, how these different perspectives can be reconciled, some of the challenges of doing big history as opposed to traditional history, and we talk a bit about the history of the future, how to think historically about the future. Here is my conversation with David Christian. Okay, so before diving down into what big history is, do you mind telling us a little bit about how the project got started?
Yeah, I'm not actually sure myself, and you know how easy it is to sort of mythologize your own transitions. But I'm a Russian historian, and during the Cold War, I felt that teaching, I always felt that teaching Russian history was significant. So the question, is what I'm teaching significant for my students, has always really concerned me. And during the Cold War, I felt Russian history was significant because it was like the other half of the world. Was, you know, the dark side for many of my students, and just trying to give a realistic account of what was going on in the Soviet Union. So I always, I guess, felt that in teaching Russian history, I was talking about the world as a whole. And I think when the Soviet Union collapsed, I had to sort of rethink things a bit, and increasingly began to feel that in a rapidly globalizing world, what young people need to know about is not the history of this nation or that nation, because in a globalized world, that looks increasingly tribal. If you don't mind me using that sort of anthropological phrase, but it looks like a kind of version of gang warfare, when nowadays the gang is humanity as a whole. So I felt we really need to be teaching, as historians, courses in the history of humanity. And yet I knew of hardly any. The nearest I could get was world history. And world history, as you may know, has its own sort of biases and limitations. And most world historians are interested in the last 500 years, not really in the last 200,000 years, which is the scale of human history. So I began with the idea, I think, of a history of humanity, but very rapidly, as I thought, how do you teach a history of humanity? I thought, at this scale, you have to engage with the idea of evolution. How did our species come about? So what you're really doing is you're offering a history of a biological species, a very strange one, a very strange one. But that very strangeness allows you, gives you some entry into these profound and sometimes metaphysical seeming questions about what makes humans different. It's a kind of empirical way into those questions. So I realized we had to talk about evolution. And then to talk about evolution seriously, I felt I had to talk about the origins of life. And to do that, I realized I had to talk about the geology of planet Earth. And then that led me into astronomy, and back and back and back. And as I went through this sort of thinking, this is mid 80s, I guess. So it was a sort of intellectual midlife crisis, is how my friends interpreted it, I think. I went back and back and back to the history of the solar system, and eventually realized that this is not an infinite regress. In an era in which our cosmology is dominated by the idea of a Big Bang, there is a starting point. So I, I suddenly thought, I wonder if you could teach a history course that began with the Big Bang and placed our species in that larger story. And I thought, if you could do it, it'll be a great way of both linking different disciplines, breaking down the divide between the humanities and sciences, but also of putting what is happening now in our world in perspective. And over the years, I've realized that putting what is happening now into perspective means realizing that we live at a turning point, not just in the history of humanity, but in the history of planet Earth, and perhaps even in the history of our part of the galaxy. What's happening is profound, but you cannot even begin to glimpse it unless you attempt this very wide vision. So that's a long answer to your question. But really, I guess at the core is the idea of understanding our strange species. Because in a globalized world, we need to think of ourselves as a single species that is now so powerful collectively that it is managing a planet.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of surprising that humans have such significance on a large geological timescale, but it's also not if you just take a look at the impact that humans have had.
Yes, and that takes us back to questions that I think I was taught to think of as kind of metaphysical or even sort of quasi-theological. which is about the nature of human beings. You know, is this a mystical question or a metaphysical one? And eventually I began to think, no, it's an empirical one. If you think of 4 billion years of life on Earth, you can ask a very simple question. What is distinctive about the history of our species? Well, the answer, I think, is, again, empirical. It's very, very simple and very, very clear. We are the first species in 4 billion years that has shown a capacity for endless intellectual creativity. And the result of that is that we break the rules of natural selection. We don't occupy a new niche and then fill that niche. We keep occupying new niches until eventually our niche is the planet as a whole. And we're the first species in 4 billion years to do that. Now, once you have a species capable of that, you have a species capable of dominating change on planetary scales. So that raises the question, what is it about us that makes us different? And it's got to be something both small and immensely significant, because we know how close we are biologically to species that have not had this impact, such as chimps above all, very close to chimps, and even sort of other species of humans, such as Neanderthals, and now we talk about Denisovans, who seem not to have had this sort of impact. Maybe given time they would have, but they didn't. So what is it about us? And I've argued for years, and I still find the answer plausible, that it's what I call collective learning. Now, that's very similar to terms other people use, such as cultural accumulation, but by that I simply mean the fact that we humans share information. Now, many species share information, okay, they have language, but we share information, it's as if with a virtuosity which takes us across a threshold. Because many species share information, but they also lose information. It's not stored efficiently enough to accumulate across generations. We've crossed that threshold so that information is stored across generations, and that changes everything. I mean, this is a wonderful example of the Hegelian quantity turning into quality. Once your sharing of information is efficient enough and on a large enough scale, then all the rules change. And what it means is that you wait a few generations or a few centuries or a few millennia, and this species is behaving differently than it did before. And you can define the direction of that difference. Its power over its environment increases because it accumulates more and more knowledge, and that knowledge is preserved across generations. So it's a very simple idea, and I think it's also enough to explain both contradictory things, both the extent of our power and our closeness to chimps, because it's as if human language doesn't need to be radically different from chimp language, but it does need to be powerful enough to have crossed this threshold. It's not language itself, it's a language that has crossed a threshold in power, linguistic power, the power, precision and volume of information that can be communicated, shared and stored. Because information, I mean, if you go back to the biological domain, organisms have both, you know, they have claws and eyes and teeth, both biological mechanisms to enable them to deal with their surroundings, but also information. If you're a brainy species, a mammal, if the information allows you to deal with your environment in improved ways, if the amount of information you have about your environment keeps increasing, then your power to control your surroundings keeps increasing. And that's the species we are. And you can start getting very powerful evidence of this increase at least 50,000 years ago. 60,000 years ago, there were humans in Australia. 40,000 years ago, there's very good evidence of massive extinctions of large animals, of fire stick farming, transforming the biota. So the fuse of this thing was lit probably 200,000 years ago, but hard evidence for fundamental change kicks in at least in the last 50,000 years, I think.
Right. So it's language and culture, both the fact that you have language and language distributed over a network of agents.
Yes, and I think they're, yeah, I'm inclined to regard the two as the same, because language itself, you're not going to get language if you don't have a species that's quite sociable. And one thing that seems pretty clear about not all, but a lot of our close biological relatives is that they're social beings. I mean, their survival strategy depends on collaborating with colleagues. Orangutans may be an exception to this, but I think most other closely related species are highly sociable, and that also helps explain why language becomes important. Because if you're sociable, you want to know what your other members of your family or community are thinking.
Right. There's speculation about octopus, right? That they are highly intelligent creatures, but they never quite develop that way because they're non-social. So whatever intelligence they may accumulate over their lifetimes, it doesn't get passed on and it doesn't aggregate.
Yes, yes, because it means that what is learnt, an individual may be a real virtuoso at learning, but what the individual learns is lost when the individual dies. And that's the great difference with us. What the individual learns becomes part of a collective store of knowledge. I've recently been reading some wonderful stuff about how knowledge is stored in indigenous communities, and how so much of the ritual activity, the dancing, the geographical activity is really a way of storing information, storing it in mnemonics, in landscapes, in rituals, in dances. And the repetition of all of this in a culture without writing is a very, very powerful way of storing, of preserving traditional information.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, you use the idea of an origin story to tell the story of big history. So can you tell us a bit about why an origin story? Why has that been a helpful device to frame this?
Right. I'm not an anthropologist, but so I skimmed the surface of many disciplines. But I think there's a fairly wide acceptance of the idea that most, perhaps all, human communities tell stories about their own pasts. I mean, this is history, um, and many of those stories can be described as origin stories in the sense that their role, again, is to pass on to the next generation everything we know about how things came to be. Not only how you came to be, but how your parents came to be, how your community came to be, how the landscape, the mountains, the rivers, the stars, the sun came to be. So that's what I think of an origin story as. And I think an origin story is a very powerful educational device. And I think it's true that all societies have some form of origin story. They may not think of it as a kind of linear history in the way that we do, but it's certainly a way of accounting for origins. And passing those stories on to young people is a very powerful way of holding all knowledge together, of framing all knowledge, not just scientific knowledge or ecological knowledge, but also ethical knowledge, and should we call it theological knowledge or spiritual knowledge? Knowledge about the rules or the understanding of the universe that your community, that's embedded in your community. And I've sort of co-opted the word origin story. I should say that my wife was a professional storyteller for many years, and she's the one who said, David, what you're doing is you're telling an origin story. So I think of big history. So the question for me was, in a modern world whose understanding of reality is shaped so profoundly by science on global scales, is there an origin story embedded in that world? And I think the answer is a very clear yes. And what I've tried to do in my teaching of big history is to tell a version of that story.
Right. One thing I found really interesting when exploring your work was the idea that origin stories throughout time have a significant empirical component to them. That you can find the roots or the attempts to do science in origin stories throughout time. And I know you can't draw an equivalency between science and stories of that sort because there's still a significant enough methodological difference. But still,
Yes, I feel this very strongly. And it's partly living in Australia where at last and belatedly, Australian scholars and politicians and thinkers are coming to terms with the reality of human communities that have lived here for 60,000 years. And the more I think about that world, the more I think the word science can usefully be extended to it. Okay, modern science has its own distinctive features, no doubt about it. So I take the idea of a scientific revolution very seriously, but the idea of knowledge that's based on a large body of empirical information, empirical observations that generate hypotheses about reality is something I take very seriously. So in that limited sense, I think of origin stories as scientific. They had to be, because you don't teach young people nonsense. You teach young people, stories that will help them survive in their world. So the origin stories contain information about animal migrations, about the seasons, about weather forecasting, about all sorts of empirical things, about how you relate to your own family and your own community. That's moral. It's empirical knowledge, but it's moral empirical knowledge. So I see modern science as very similar to that, with the difference that it's based on vastly more hard information in a globalized world. Science is the knowledge of reality that has emerged in a globalized world. I think there's a growing realization of the extent to which modern science, even if you can first locate it in Europe, depended on globalization, on information from many societies, for example, on observations taken all around the world. So I think of modern science as the scientific knowledge of a global world.
Right, absolutely. Very rarely do intellectual traditions not borrow from previous eras.
Yes, of course. Of course, it's so easy when you study modern science to see the differences between modern science and traditional small s science, as I've defined it, which we often describe as religion or theology, or we use anthropological terms like animism or whatever it is. And I do think, one of the great differences is that, and in my book on the future, this is something that came clearer to me, that one of the great differences about modern science, I think, is it's abandoned a hypothesis that was almost universal in most human societies and is still widely held today. And that's the hypothesis that we humans are surrounded by beings, non-human beings of many, many kinds, who play a fundamental role in the universe. And that was a hypothesis that I think made a lot of sense. But modern science has achieved a hell of a lot by abandoning that hypothesis and focusing on the idea that most processes in the universe are not caused by conscious decisions of conscious beings. Politics is an exception, of course, which is why politics is so unpredictable. And modern science has achieved a lot on the basis of that assumption. This is what Weber called oh God, what's his term? The disenchantment
Yeah.
of the world. Yeah.
Do you think the humanities today serve that role of exploring the things that the natural sciences have excluded?
Yeah, I guess that's maybe a nice way of putting it. So science has made such progress by pushing this idea of exploring mechanical, non-conscious processes that by definition are more predictable than conscious processes. I mean, if there are magical forces going around, or if there are spirits of various kinds, I really can't predict their behavior. But if in fact it's the law of gravity I'm operating with, then the universe is much more predictable. But I think you're absolutely right that in a scientific world, there's a danger of overlooking those areas of reality where conscious and inevitably somewhat what's the word? Less law-abiding processes take place. And by definition, the human domain is such a domain. We don't find the kind of regularities that we do with the law of gravity or with planetary orbits when we're dealing with human biographies or with politics, in which individual human quirkiness plays a huge role. So yes, that's a nice way of putting it, that maybe the humanities disciplines are very often exploring those domains in which remain enchanted, I guess, to sort of turn Weber's metaphor, borrowed from Schiller apparently, to turn his metaphor upside down.
It seems that there's a bit of a trade-off where because the sciences have been reductionist and mechanistic, and often siloed off and specialized, they've been able to achieve a lot and very, very efficient, but it's excluded a bit of that human experience side of it. But where the humanities can capture that human experience, they tend to be so fragmented that you don't get the emergence of these large paradigm ideas the way that you see in the natural sciences.
But in defense of science, I mean, in my own experience of now some 30 years of trying to teach big history and trying to persuade people that it ought to be part of modern school and university syllabi, without great success, I have to say, I found that despite the hyper specialization of science, one of the great virtues of science is that all scientists know that there are vast generalizations that span most of science that have to be taken seriously. Now, this is not true in the humanities, which by and large lack paradigm ideas. So that there's a strange sense in which the humanities, I found, are more prone to hyper specialization than the sciences, because every scientist knows that there are paradigms there and they have to take them seriously. In the humanities, it's quite acceptable to cast doubt on that idea. So I have found conversations with scientists about big history much easier than, for most scientists, the idea of big history is a no-brainer. It's just, they may be specialists, but why not? Why not teach the history of the universe? Cosmologists do this all the time. But the scientists you're quite right, do often lack respect for the kind of fuzziness of the domains that scholars in the humanities deal with. And I think that's what the humanities disciplines can bring to these debates. But the best scientists are acutely aware of all of this. And the probabilistic nature of modern science sort of prepares them for this. And it means that science today, at its best, lacks the determinism and extreme mechanism, extremely mechanical nature of 19th century science, which was deterministic.
How's the experience been for you as a historian, having sort of these general curiosities, but being embedded in a space that often lends itself towards hyper contextualization?
Well, look, I think big history is all about contextualizing, by the way. But it's a different sort of contextualization to what most historians deal with. I'm trying to see human history in the context of the history of the biosphere and see the history of the biosphere in the context of the universe. So that's all about contextualization. But how's it been? I think partly, I sometimes think that we underestimate the extent to which we come at disciplines with particular mindsets. Most historians, in my experience, are, my wife's a Jungian scholar, or she knows a lot about Jung. So, and Jung talked about people who glom on to the details and they find the details exciting and revealing and full of meaning. There are others who scoot past the details and look for the grand generalizations. I think most historians are the first type, but I think my mind was always the second type. I couldn't make sense of the details unless I had some sort of general framework. So, for a time, for example, as a scholar of the Soviet Union, I was very interested in Marx, fascinated by his project of creating a paradigm within what we might think of as humanities disciplines. So that may be why I found it easier than most historians to sort of look for paradigms within the humanities, which is something that many people in the humanities resist, and some resist it passionately. But I have to say, one of the things I've learned over 30 years, I think, is how deep and how subtle is the resistance to that project within the humanities, and how subtle and hard to negotiate with are the discipline boundaries. Let me give you one example. Big history was taught at Macquarie University, where I've taught most of my career for 30 years, from 1989 to 1921. During the pandemic, it vanished. Now, that was partly because I retired, but there was a young scholar who could have taught those big courses. They drew in students from across the university, generally drew several hundred students. But the university issued a sort of a fatwa, an instruction to the department saying you can only have 2 first-year courses. So that was a challenge to each department, including the modern history department, where by accident, big history was taught. Are you going to keep the big history course, most of which has nothing to do with what is conventionally thought of as modern history? Or are you going to keep the course on Australian history or a course on European history? And for the department, of course, it was a no-brainer, because the loyalties, the career paths, the self-definitions, the sense of self-respect of the scholars involved were bound up with the definition of themselves as modern historians. So the resistance to this sort of interdisciplinarity is not so much overt as covert and subtle and embedded within the structures of today's universities and the way knowledge is taught. Now, I personally think that's tragic, because I think in a globalized way, it's absolutely so vital in today's world that young people grow up thinking of themselves as members of a human community. But a fragmented teaching of history and literature and culture cannot help them towards that understanding. Whereas I think big history has the potential to do that. So I think it's as if the academic world, universities and school syllabi are designed for a world in which the dominant social entities were indeed roughly on the scale of nation states. They weren't all nation states, but they were roughly on that scale. Whereas today we desperately need an origin story, which is an origin story in some sense for all human beings. Now, that project is one, again, that I find many colleagues in the humanities deeply skeptical about, because they assume immediately that that will homogenize, which is nonsense, because we teach national histories, we talk about national cultures or gender histories, or and we know that you can talk about large categories. It doesn't necessarily lead to homogenization if it's done well. So I'm probably stating the obvious, but what is not so obvious is how subtle are the barriers to what may seem a simple project like teaching the history of humanity in place of the older histories of nations. And given the fact that nation states still fund education, of course, there's a financial aspect to all of this. Who's going to fund histories of humanity?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's especially tragic because I think studying history lends itself to being interested in these large general questions. Yeah, I don't know how you study the intellectual history of Russia and not be curious about large philosophical problems, but there is a bit of a pushback, some discouragement there that those kinds of questions shouldn't be pursued formally within history. They should be left for another department.
Yeah, I think so much of the Russian intellectual tradition, and I love Russian culture, I love Russian literature, which is one of so many reasons why what's happening right now is so tragic. Seeing a country whose intellectual traditions I admire being dominated by a sort of crude and brutal nationalism is just horrifying. Anyway, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it may be partly being a Russian historian that pushed me in these directions, but then the whole Marxist tradition, which so shaped Russian Soviet history in the 20th century, is universalizing. I mean, I think of Marx as someone, but he was not the only one. Alexander von Humboldt is less known, but another example of a 19th century scholar. I mean, even people like Spencer, who most people in the humanities today tend to sort of despise because their ideas, in retrospect, look a bit wooden. But their impulse was, I think, the same. It was to find a large paradigm idea that could help us better understand the history of our own species. So I think people like Marx, they were trying to put together a history of humanity as a species.